10 tourists, 10 trails. Not one of them made it home. Pull up the map, lock the car, and stay close, because in these parks, the distance between lost and gone is about 50 feet. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. The 14th of June, 1969. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the Martins were exactly where they were supposed to be. Father Bill Martin had brought his family to Spence Field, a wide, grassy bald sitting high on the Appalachian Trail, tucked inside the Cades Cove subdistrict of a park that spans more than 522,000 acres of Tennessee and North Carolina ridgeline. Spence Field is the kind of place that makes you feel safe. It opens up suddenly after a long climb through dense forest. Broad sky, long sight lines, meadow grass bending in a mountain breeze. Standing there on a clear afternoon, with the ridgeline dropping away on both sides and the trail visible in either direction, you feel like you could see everything coming from a mile out. It was the kind of trip families planned months in advance, the kind with coolers and trail maps, and at least one dog pulling hard at a leash. The Martins had all of it, including the family German Shepherd, Lady, and a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Lloyd Martin, who was, by every account, just days away from his 7th birthday. Dennis was a quiet kid, a Knoxville boy. He wore a red t-shirt that afternoon, green shorts, and a pair of Oxford shoes, not exactly hiking footwear, but the outing was meant to be easy. Spence Field was familiar territory for a family day walk, not a technical climb. The air was warm, the trail was clear. The meadow was full of daylight with hours still left in the afternoon. There was no reason at all to be afraid. Here's the critical detail about how June 14 was supposed to end. Dennis had been playing with a small group of boys throughout the afternoon, his older brother, and a few friends who had joined the Martin family on the trip. Somewhere along the trail that day, the boys cooked up a game. A prank, really. The plan was simple. Split up, circle around through the brush on either side of the trail, and jump out simultaneously to startle the adults waiting at the far end of the meadow. It was the kind of thing kids have done on trails since there have been trails harmless, silly, designed to be over in 30 seconds. The adults were within earshot. The meadow was open. There were multiple people standing right there in the afternoon light. The brush the boys planned to cut through was only a few yards deep, shallow enough that you could practically see through it from the trail edge. Every condition that should have made this completely safe was in place. The older boys went one direction through the brush. Dennis went the other, and that's the last confirmed time anyone saw him. The older boys burst out of the tree line right on cue, laughing and pushing each other. The adults turned, ready to perform the required level of surprise. A head count happened quick, informal, the way it does in groups that have been together all day and have no reason to think anything is wrong. And then someone said Dennis's name. A beat of silence. His brother looked back toward where Dennis should have emerged from the brush. Nothing moved. Bill Martin called into the tree line, first calmly, then with more urgency, his voice carrying across the open bald and disappearing into the forest without any answer coming back. He moved toward the spot where Dennis had gone in, pushed through the brush himself, and called the boy's name in every direction he could face. He then hiked roughly a mile east along the Appalachian Trail, stopping at intervals to stand completely still and listen for anything, footsteps, rustling, a child's voice. The trail was empty in both directions. The forest was quiet, in the way that forests only get quiet when something has already gone wrong. He doubled back toward the meadow, checked every place a small boy might logically go, and found nothing. By the time rangers were formally notified and a structured search got underway, the afternoon light was already beginning to drain from the ridgeline, and the temperature on the bald was starting to drop. And then the storm came. It moved in fast and hit hard, not a passing shower, not an inconvenient drizzle, but a sustained, driving downpour that hammered Spence Field and the surrounding forest for hours through the night. 3 inches of rain fell. It hit the soft trail soil and the leaf litter and the exposed bald grass, and it washed everything clean with a thoroughness that nothing else could have managed so quickly. Whatever impressions a small boy's Oxford shoes might have left in the damp ground, whatever faint disturbance a 6-year-old body moving fast through shallow underbrush might have created in the leaf mat and the soft earth, was erased by morning. When search dogs arrived to work the scent trail, the rain had done its work completely. The dogs worked the area around the prank site, worked the bald itself, worked the first 100 yards of every trail branching away from Spence Field, and came back without a direction to follow. The storm had taken the one thing no search team can operate without. Now this is where the case turns dark. In the days that followed Dennis's disappearance, the search expanded into something that had no real precedent in the park's history. Estimates put the total number of searchers deployed at somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 people at the effort's peak, spread across a search zone that eventually covered approximately 56 square miles of rugged Appalachian terrain. This wasn't just rangers with radios. This was civilian volunteers, Boy Scout troops, trained tracking teams, and eventually a contingent of Green Berets from a nearby military installation soldiers, specifically trained in the kind of methodical wilderness grid searching that a missing child case demands. The park superintendent, in those early days, reportedly expressed confidence that Dennis would be found within a few miles of Spence Field. The terrain was difficult but not impassable. The park was vast, but it was mapped, well-traveled, and well-resourced. People did not simply vanish from it without leaving any trace behind. But here's what doesn't make sense. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of red fabric snagged on a low branch, not a single print or disturbed piece of ground that pointed in any useful direction. The search teams moved through the forest in organized lines, called his name into every hollow and drainage and laurel thicket they crossed, and came back empty-handed, day after day after day. A child in a red shirt, high visibility by design, even at distance, even in the filtered green light of an Appalachian forest, had walked 15 feet into a stand of brush, a few yards from his family, and left no trail that 1,400 trained and motivated people could follow across. 56 square miles over weeks of sustained effort. The math of that simply does not resolve cleanly into any explanation that feels adequate. A formal review conducted in October of that year examined the search operation critically, and what it found was uncomfortable reading. The initial response had been disorganized. Volunteers arrived in the first crucial hours without clear coordination structures in place. Ground teams overlapped coverage in some sectors while leaving gaps in others. The critical early window, the period when a young child's trail is still fresh, still warm, still potentially readable by tracking dogs, before weather and time degrade, it had been partially lost, not just to the storm, but to the organizational disorder running underneath the operation in those opening hours. The October review named those failures directly and on the record. That matters, because it means the question of what happened to Dennis Martin is not only a question about what the forest did or didn't do, it is also a question about whether a better organized first response might have produced a different outcome, and that question will never have a resolution either. There is one more detail that circulates in accounts of this case, and it needs to be clearly labeled for what it is, reported but not verified. In the hours following Dennis's disappearance, a family in the area reportedly heard what some sources describe as a disturbing, prolonged scream somewhere in the surrounding woods, a sound that some accounts place at a location between 7 and 9 miles from Spence Field. Around approximately the same time, an unkempt, visibly disheveled man was reportedly observed in the vicinity by witnesses who later came forward. Neither the sound nor the man was ever connected to Dennis's disappearance through any confirmed evidence. No suspect was ever identified. No charges were ever filed. These details appear in some tellings of this case and are absent entirely from others, and the honest position is that no one knows what weight, if any, to assign them. What the official record holds is this: a boy in a red t-shirt, 6 years old, walked behind a shallow stand of brush at roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, while his brother stood yards away and watched him go and was never seen again. The search that followed was one of the largest ever mounted in the Appalachian Range. The forest returned nothing, not a trace of clothing, not a bone, not a single object that had ever belonged to Dennis Lloyd Martin. He remains listed as missing. The park that holds him is still open every single day, receiving millions of visitors along those same ridgelines, still vast and quiet and utterly indifferent along the Tennessee-North Carolina line. The most searched-for boy in park history left one thing behind: silence. The next one had a camera in her hands, and they only ever found the lens cap. The 17th of July, 1981. Yosemite National Park, California. There is a trail system in Yosemite that most casual visitors never see. Not the valley floor with its waterfalls and shuttle buses and crowded viewpoints, something else entirely. The High Sierra Camp Loop runs approximately 49 to 50 miles through the backcountry above the valley, linking a chain of remote tent camps set at elevations above 9,000 feet. The terrain up there is a different world from the postcard version of Yosemite most people know. Granite boulder fields the size of city blocks, alpine meadows rimmed by peaks, ice-cold lakes sitting in open rock basins where the wind moves without interruption and the temperature can drop 20 degrees in an hour when a cloud system moves through. The camps exist to give hikers a way to travel through that world with a degree of support meals, a sleeping tent, a marked destination at the end of each day, but the landscape itself is unapologetic. It does not soften for tourists. At 9,400 feet, in the thin air above the tree line, the granite does what granite does. It sits there, enormous and indifferent, fractured into shapes that create shadows and voids, and drops you cannot see until you are already standing at the edge of one. People come up here specifically because it feels remote and serious, and unlike anywhere they live. That feeling is accurate. The terrain earns it. Stacy Ann Arras was 14 years old, and by every account, she was exactly the kind of person who belonged in that landscape. She was from Saratoga, California, an outdoorsy girl who loved photography and horses, comfortable in wild places in the way that some teenagers simply are. Not the kind of kid who had to be persuaded into a backcountry trip or talked into finishing a long approach. She carried an Olympus camera on the journey, which is the kind of detail that matters because it tells you something specific about how she moved through places like this. She was paying attention to them. She was pointing her lens at things she considered worth preserving. This was not a girl wandering through terrain she was indifferent to. This was a girl actively engaging with it, framing it, looking for the angle that would do it justice. Photography demands that you stop moving, stand still, and look carefully at a single thing long enough to decide it's worth keeping. Stacy did that on this trip, and the people who knew her would have recognized it as entirely characteristic of who she was. On the 17th of July, 1981, Stacy and her father arrived at Sunrise High Sierra Camp after riding in from Tuolumne Meadows along the John Muir Trail, a long, demanding approach through some of the most remote and beautiful terrain in the park. The group had stopped at Cathedral Lake and Upper Cathedral Lake along the way, taking in the high-elevation scenery before the final push to camp. They arrived at sunrise in the mid-afternoon, tired from the day's ride but not in distress. The Sunrise Camp sits at approximately 9,400 feet, near the cluster of lakes that give it its name, Sunrise Lakes, roughly a mile and a half away, through open alpine terrain that looks safe and manageable in afternoon light. From the camp itself, you can read the general direction of the lake. The ridgeline is visible. The trail heading toward it is not hidden or complicated. In that particular light, at that particular hour, the distance between where Stacy was standing and where she wanted to go looked entirely reasonable. Here's the critical detail about what Stacy did next. She told her father she wanted to walk down to the lake to take photographs. It was a short, logical extension of the day, a walk across visible ground to a nearby destination. The kind of thing guests at Sunrise did routinely in the late afternoon when the light was good and the day's riding was behind them. Her father considered going with her. He decided not to. He was tired from the approach, and the camp was right there, staffed and solid, and the lake was a walk you could practically orient to from where he stood. She was 14, physically capable, outdoors, experienced, and carrying a camera she was clearly eager to use in the evening alpine light. There was nothing in that decision, as he made it, that carried any perceptible weight of danger. He watched her go. An elderly companion from the group identified in various accounts only as Gerald chose to walk partway with Stacy toward the lake. He was not well suited to the uneven terrain and tired quickly after a short distance, the broken granite footing demanding more energy than he had left after the day's approach. He stopped to rest at a point along the route and told her he would wait there for her to return. By his account, he could still see her from where he sat, or had been able to, for a few minutes at least, before the boulder formations and the terrain folds between them made a clean line of sight impossible. The accounts vary slightly on the exact timing of what followed, but he waited somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes at that resting spot before it became clear to him that Stacy was not returning on any schedule that made sense. He made his way back to camp, where her father was waiting. A check of the immediate area around the camp turned up nothing. Rangers were contacted. The search was formalized and on its feet before dark, a rapid response, as park searches go, with the camp staff and the trail system already providing an initial framework for where to look and how wide to cast. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw her. A guide associated with the camp, who reported seeing Stacy standing on a rock approximately 50 yards south of the trail, the camera presumably raised or ready. The granite and the fading afternoon light spread out around her in every direction. What followed was one of the largest searches ever conducted in Yosemite National Park. Thousands of man-hours deployed over 9 days. Helicopters running passes over the boulder fields and the lake basin from above, covering ground that foot teams would take hours to cross. Grid searches on foot through terrain so broken and irregular that a systematic sweep takes days, not hours, and still leaves gaps in coverage that no team leader is entirely comfortable signing off on. The granite up there is not smooth and continuous. It fractures and stacks in formations that create voids, overhangs, and drops that are completely invisible from above. Places where a person could come to rest and simply not be visible from 10 feet away, let alone from a helicopter at altitude. The search teams expanded their perimeter outward as each inner ring came back empty. They used dogs where the terrain allowed, and aircraft where the terrain defeated foot teams entirely. They worked the trail between the camp and the lake in both directions, the boulder fields flanking the route on both sides, the lake basin itself, the surrounding ridgeline, and the drainage corridors running down from the high ground. They spoke to every guest and staff member at the camp who had been present that afternoon. They followed every reported sighting and every suggested route. They kept coming back with nothing. They found her camera lens cap. That was it. That was the full sum of what 9 days of intensive searching returned from thousands of man-hours of effort concentrated on a staffed camp and a nearby alpine lake. A single lens cap, sitting on the granite somewhere along or near the route she had taken. No camera, no pack, no clothing, no blood, no disturbed ground consistent with a fall. No body visible in any of the voids and fractures the search teams examined. Nothing that pointed forward or backward or in any direction at all. Just a small piece of camera equipment sitting on the rock in open terrain, as if she had set it down for a moment to frame a shot and would be back for it shortly. But here's what doesn't make sense. Stacy vanished in the vicinity of a staffed, occupied camp, not a remote wilderness corridor that sees a handful of hikers per season, but a destination camp on a popular backcountry loop, with trained staff on site, with other guests in residence, with routes in and out that were well-traveled and well-documented. The companion who had walked partway with her was, by all accounts, physically incapable of having contributed to her disappearance. The search response was rapid, substantial, and professionally executed. The terrain, while genuinely difficult, was not so vast or so trackless that 9 days of intensive effort with helicopters, dogs, and coordinated ground teams should have produced nothing at all. And yet it did. That gap between the scale of the search and the absolute emptiness of its result is one of the most uncomfortable facts in this entire case file. It forces a question that has no clean answer. How do you search a place that thoroughly and come back with one lens cap? Now this is where the case turns genuinely strange. Some sources note that Stacy was not the only person to go missing in that particular section of Yosemite's high country during that general period. 3 other individuals reportedly vanished near sunrise and the surrounding high camp zone in the years surrounding 1981. This detail appears across various accounts of the Aris case, but it has not been confirmed through a single authoritative source, and the honest label for it is reported but not verified. What is fully confirmed is that Stacy's case remains officially open. She has never been found. No cause of death has ever been formally established. No suspect in a case where foul play has never been conclusively ruled out has ever been identified or charged. The most commonly offered explanation is a fall. The boulder fields between the camp and the lake are threaded with exactly the kind of terrain that swallows mistakes, without warning gaps between massive fractured stones. Faces that look manageable until they aren't. Drops that are invisible until you are already committed to them. It is entirely possible that Stacy stepped off the marked route to find a better camera angle, moved onto unstable ground, and fell into a void the search teams never located. Documented search operations in high granite Yosemite terrain have found that a body can come to rest in a location genuinely invisible from the surface above it, even to searchers passing within yards. That is operational reality, not atmosphere, and it matters when you are trying to understand how 9 days of serious effort produced one lens cap and nothing else. Foul play has never been definitively ruled out either. No evidence has emerged to close that door. The case sits exactly where it has always sat, open, unresolved, and anchored to that single object on the granite. A 14-year-old girl walked toward a lake with a camera in her hands, in broad afternoon light, 50 yards from a trail she knew. The search was immediate. The effort was massive, and the only thing the granite gave back was the lens cap, the last thing she ever pointed at the world. If you've been following these cases and want more, hit subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. The next girl vanished with 40 classmates around her. The 8th of October, 1976, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from losing someone in a crowd. Not the sudden, clean fear of watching a person step into danger alone, but the slow, nauseating realization that somewhere between here and there, inside a group of people who were all supposed to be paying attention, a person simply stopped being present, and nobody caught the exact moment it happened. It is a fear made worse by arithmetic. The more people around, the safer a situation appears. The safer it appears, the less any individual person in the group feels personally responsible for accounting for every other individual. This is not negligence, it is human psychology operating exactly as designed, the same distributed attention effect that makes crowds feel safe in the first place. It is also, in certain terrible circumstances, exactly what the situation exploits. Trenny Lynn Gibson was 16 years old, a junior at Bearden High School in Knoxville, Tennessee. She was approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed around 115 pounds. On the morning of the 8th of October 1976, she boarded a school bus for a field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains, a day outing to Clingman's Dome, which sits at the highest point in the entire park, nearly 6,644 feet above sea level, straddling the Tennessee-North Carolina line. Clingman's Dome, now officially renamed Kuohi, in recognition of its Cherokee name, is one of the most visited points in the most visited national park in the United States. On a clear October day, the Forney Ridge Trail from the Clingman's Dome parking area out to Andrews Bald and back is a reasonable, popular, well-marked route. It draws school groups regularly. The parking area sits right there at the trailhead, a visible, reachable endpoint at the top of a paved road. That morning, Trenny wore a brown plaid jacket over a blue and white sweater, blue Adidas sneakers, and a sapphire and diamond ring on her finger. She brought her dog, Mitzi, on the trip. She was, by all accounts, in good spirits, the kind of teenager who was eager to be at the front of the group, not lagging behind it. Classmates who spoke with her that morning described her as energetic, talkative, looking forward to the outing. Nothing in her behavior that day suggested she was distressed, unwell, or anything other than a 16-year-old on a school trip to the mountains on a clear fall afternoon. Here's the critical detail about how the afternoon was organized. Approximately 40 students made the Forney Ridge hike that day. They were accompanied by a single adult chaperone, a teacher named Wayne Dunlap. One adult, 40 teenagers. On a trail in the backcountry of the most visited national park in America, that ratio would later draw significant criticism from people examining the case, and it should, because the simple mechanics of supervising 40 adolescents on a mountain trail with one set of eyes make a meaningful head count at any given moment functionally impossible. A group of 40 people moving along a trail at varying paces, stopping at different points to look at things or rest or talk among themselves, naturally stretches across a distance of several hundred yards without anyone intending it to. The front of the group and the back of the group are not in visual contact. The middle is not fully visible from either end. You can be completely absorbed in supervising the 12 teenagers immediately around you, while 6 more are having a conversation, 2 bends behind you, and 2 more have gone ahead around the next curve. And none of that represents a failure. Exactly. It just represents the geometry of moving 40 people through the woods with 1 adult. The trail itself is not especially remote or technically demanding, which probably made the ratio feel more acceptable when the trip was being planned than it turned out to be in practice. Forney Ridge is a real trail in real terrain, and real terrain does not flatten itself out because the adult-to-student ratio is unfavorable. The group hiked out to Andrews Bald and turned around in the mid-afternoon, heading back toward the parking area and the buses waiting at the Klingman's Dome lot. The return hike along Forney Ridge Trail covers roughly half a mile of terrain between the Bald and the parking area, not a demanding distance, not technically difficult. A relatively straightforward walk back on a marked trail to a known endpoint. Trenny, by the accounts of classmates who were near her during the return, was moving at or near the front of the group. She was eager to get back, moving with purpose, apparently not distressed or struggling with the terrain in any way. The parking lot was close. The buses were visible, or nearly so. The afternoon was winding down in the ordinary way. School field trips wind down that particular specific mood of collective, tired readiness to sit down and ride home. Trenny was walking back into exactly that. She was approximately half a mile from the buses, moving toward them, inside a group of classmates. And then she wasn't. The head count at the bus came up 1 short. It took a moment for that number to resolve into certainty. 40 students were supposed to be standing in the parking lot, and the count kept coming back at 39. Names were called. Students checked with each other. Dunlap moved back along the trail, calling her name into the late afternoon forest. A dusk search began immediately, organized quickly given the circumstances, working back along Forney Ridge Trail in the direction from which the group had just come. Parents were notified. Someone drove items of Trenny's clothing to the trailhead, so search dogs could establish a scent baseline. The dogs were deployed as fast as conditions allowed, working the trail and the areas flanking it in both directions from the point where the group believed they had last seen her. The search continued until approximately 3 in the morning, when it was called off due to weather conditions and the difficulty of working the terrain safely in darkness. By the time first light came on October 9th, a structured, multi-day search operation was underway, working the Forney Ridge corridor and expanding outward from there into the surrounding backcountry, covering secondary trails, drainage corridors, and the steep terrain falling away from the ridgeline on both the Tennessee and North Carolina sides of the park boundary. And this is where the case turns genuinely strange, because the dogs did find something. They found her scent. They picked it up clearly on the Forney Ridge Trail and tracked it with confidence, not drifting, not uncertain, but working a solid, readable trail, the way dogs work when the scent is strong and recent. The track moved away from the main trail at a certain point and followed a route toward the Forney Creek Trail, a secondary path branching away from the Klingman's Dome area and descending into more remote terrain on the North Carolina side of the park. The dogs worked that track with purpose, handlers moving behind them through the mixed hardwood and spruce forest that covers the lower sections of the ridgeline, the undergrowth thickening as the elevation dropped and the trail moved away from the well-traveled tourist corridor near the summit. And then the scent trail ended at a road. Not in the woods, not on the trail, not at the edge of a drop or the bank of a creek or any of the places where a lost teenager might logically come to rest in terrain she was unfamiliar with. The track ran to a road, a surface designed for vehicles, accessible to anyone driving through the area, wide enough for a car to pull off briefly and then rejoin the paved route without leaving any lasting trace of having stopped. The scent trail stopped where the road began, and it did not resume on the other side. Here's the critical detail about what that means and what it doesn't mean. A scent trail ending at a road is consistent with a person getting into a vehicle at that location. Dogs trained for trailing work stop tracking when a subject's ground scent terminates, and ground scent terminates when a person leaves the ground when they step into a car, for instance. That is one reading of the evidence. But a scent trail ending at a road is also consistent with other explanations that have nothing to do with a vehicle, including terrain effects on scent dispersal in areas where human foot traffic, vehicle exhaust, and road-related odors complicate a dog's ability to continue working a track. The honest position is that the dog evidence points toward the road but does not, on its own, constitute proof of what happened at that location. What investigators were left with was a trail of scent that walked a missing teenager to the edge of a road, willingly or otherwise, is a question that has never been answered and then stopped. The road offered no cooperating evidence of its own. No tire marks, no witness who remembered a car stopped at that particular point on that particular afternoon. No one who saw a girl in a brown plaid jacket anywhere in the area after the group's head count came up short. Trenny's sapphire and diamond ring was never recovered. It never surfaced in any pawnshop record. No estate sale, no evidence log, no tip that led anywhere useful. For investigators looking at the case from the abduction angle, that detail carries real weight. A ring of that description, worn by a teenager, is not the kind of object that disappears quietly on its own in mountain terrain the way a piece of fabric or a shoe might. It is an object with identifiable characteristics and monetary value, the kind of object that generates a paper trail when it moves through legitimate channels. It never generated one. Decades of follow-up produced nothing. The ring, like the girl who wore it, simply ceased to have any presence in the documented world after the afternoon of the 8th of October 1976. But here's what doesn't make sense, regardless of which explanation you favor. Trenny Gibson vanished from inside a moving group of roughly 40 people on a half-mile walk back to a bus. She was at or near the front of the group, moving towards safety, not away from it, with the parking lot close enough that she could likely see it, or nearly so. The last place she was seen by classmates was in motion, on the trail, in the direction of the buses, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. The distance between her last confirmed position inside the group and the parking lot was measured in minutes of walking. Whatever happened in that space, that narrow geographic and temporal gap between walking and gone, happened fast, and happened without producing any cry for help that 40 teenagers heard and remembered. That silence is the most uncomfortable fact in this case. 40 people, half a mile. A parking lot in sight, and somehow the window opened and closed and no one saw it happen. The search continued for weeks after October 8th. Bloodhounds and German shepherds worked the area repeatedly, handlers returning to the same corridors when new theories about her route emerged. Following the terrain south toward Forney Creek and west along the ridgeline wherever a lead pointed, ground teams covered the surrounding terrain extensively. The case drew sustained attention from investigators, from the media, and from the Knoxville community Trenny's family lived in. Nothing materialized. No physical evidence beyond the dog track to the road. No witness who came forward with something useful and verifiable. No Mitzi, either. The dog was never found. The institutional failure of the 1-to-40 chaperone ratio was discussed and criticized in the aftermath, and it contributed to nothing in the way of a resolution. The criticism didn't bring her back. It just established that the conditions that day had made this particular kind of gap possible, had made it easy, in a way that a different configuration might not have. Trenny Gibson has never been found. The case remains open. The road the dogs walked her to sits there in the Smokies, the same way it always, has a strip of asphalt through the trees, completely ordinary, the kind of road you pass without looking twice. Her scent walked to the road's edge and then it just stopped. If these cases are hitting different for you, subscribe. There are a lot more files where this one came from. The next case is older, colder, and they found the boat, but not the couple. The 18th of November, 1928. Grand Canyon National Park, Arizona. There is a version of the Grand Canyon that most visitors never encounter. The rim version, the overlooks, the mule rides, the visitor center with its orientation film and its gift shop selling turquoise jewelry, is the version the Park Service has spent a century making accessible, interpretable, safe enough for anyone who can walk a paved path and read a placard. That version is genuinely spectacular. It is also, in the most fundamental sense, a curated experience of something that refuses to be curated. Below the rim, the Colorado River runs through a corridor that the canyon walls have been building for 5 to 6 million years, and the river does not care about the infrastructure above it. At river level, the Grand Canyon is a different category of place, entirely a slot of ancient stone, in places more than a mile deep, where the water moves through rapids with the indifferent force of geography, operating on a timescale that makes human presence feel briefly absurd. In 1928, the commercial river running industry that would eventually make the Colorado a managed tourist experience did not yet exist. No outfitter was selling 2-week raft trips with gear lists and satellite phones and professional guides trained in swift water rescue. The river was something that a small number of serious, experienced people attempted on their own terms, in their own boats, carrying their own supplies, with no support structure waiting downstream and no reliable way to communicate with anyone on the outside once they pushed off from the put-in. It was, in 1928, genuinely and completely wild in a way that almost no accessible American waterway is anymore. Glenn Hyde knew this, and he went anyway. He was 29 years old, an experienced river runner from Idaho, with a background in rough water that was real, and earned not the casual familiarity of someone who had canoed a few gentle rivers, but the specific competence of a man who had spent real time on serious water and understood what it demanded. He had designed and built the boat himself, a 20-foot sweep scow he called Rain in the Face, a flat-bottomed craft steered by long wooden oars at each end, heavy and stable, and suited to the kind of high-volume whitewater the Colorado threw at anything floating on it. The scow was not elegant. It was not the kind of vessel that inspired confidence on sight. But Glenn had built it for a specific purpose, and he understood how it handled. And that counted for something on a river where the difference between a boat that worked and one that didn't was measured in seconds. Bessie Hyde was 22 years old, and the Colorado River trip was, by any honest accounting, not her native terrain. She was a bohemian by temperament, artistic, independent, drawn to the unconventional, but she was a novice on whitewater, learning the river in real time as the trip progressed, adapting to conditions that experienced boaters spent years preparing for. She kept a diary throughout the journey, recording the days in the water and the canyon in the particular way a person records things when they understand that they are moving through something worth preserving in language. She was also attempting something no woman had yet done: complete a full navigation of the Grand Canyon by river. That record, combined with Glenn's goal of setting a speed record for the traverse, gave the trip a specific ambition that went beyond recreation. This was an attempt at something. It had stakes beyond their personal safety, stakes that created pressure to continue moving, to push through sections that caution alone might have argued against running. Here's the critical detail about the last time anyone saw them. Glenn and Bessie stopped at Grand Canyon Village on the 16th of November, 1928, 2 days before they disappeared to resupply. While there, they encountered Emery and Ellsworth Kolb, the photographer brothers whose studio on the South Rim had been a landmark of canyon life for decades. The Kolbs were legendary figures in the world of canyon exploration, serious, experienced men who understood the river as well as anyone alive in 1928. Emery Kolb, in particular, had run the canyon himself and knew what the water below looked like in late November. By some accounts, he looked at their setup, the scow, the lack of life jackets, the late-season timing, and expressed concern. What was said between them at Bright Angel Trail on the 16th of November, 1928, exactly and in full, is not something the historical record preserves with precision. What is confirmed is that Glenn and Bessie loaded their supplies, pushed off from the bank, and moved downstream into the canyon. Emery Kolb watched them go. That is the last confirmed sighting of Glenn and Bessie Hyde together, alive, by any witness whose account is part of the documented record. They were due to arrive at Needles, California, the downstream endpoint of their run, on a schedule that assumed steady progress through the remaining river miles. When they didn't arrive, and when the window of reasonable delay closed without any word from them, a search was organized. A search plane was dispatched to fly the river corridor, covering the miles of canyon between their last known position and the takeout at Needles, scanning the river and the narrow beaches and the rock ledges for any sign of the boat or the couple. And this is where the case turns strange. The plane found the scow. It was floating upright, intact, undamaged in any way that would have been visible from the air, at approximately river mile 237, deep in the canyon, well past Hermit Rapid, where records suggest they were last on the river. The scow was not swamped. It was not pinned against a rock in the aftermath of a capsize. It was not drifting with its contents scattered across the water in the way a boat's gear distributes itself after a serious upset. It was sitting in the river exactly as a boat sits when it has been left supplies strapped in, gear in place. Bessie's diary aboard with a final entry dated to approximately November 30th. The boat looked, from the air and on closer examination, like a vessel whose crew had stepped ashore for a moment and intended to come back. Every piece of equipment that Glenn and Bessie had loaded onto that scow at their last resupply was still there. The only things missing were the two people who had been running it. But here's what doesn't make sense. An intact boat, fully supplied, floating upright in the Colorado River in late November 1928, is not consistent with a straightforward drowning narrative. When a boat capsizes in serious whitewater and its occupants go into the river, the water does work on everything involved on the boat, on the gear, on the shoreline it moves past. It scatters. It breaks apart. It leaves a debris field that search parties can read. The Colorado in the Grand Canyon is not a gentle river that might absorb a capsize tidally and leave everything in order. What the search found instead was an orderly boat packed, strapped, sitting in the water with Bessie's diary, still legible aboard, and a complete absence of the two people who had been living on it for weeks. There is no physical evidence the historical record contains that explains cleanly how you get from Glenn and Bessie running their boat through the Grand Canyon to their boat floating alone, fully intact, with all their gear aboard, without requiring a set of circumstances that the evidence refuses to fully support. Emery Kolb led a ground and air search of the canyon in the aftermath of the discovery. Teams checked the narrow beaches and rocky margins that line the Colorado through that section, looking for any sign that the couple had come ashore voluntarily or otherwise. The canyon walls in that stretch are not the kind of terrain that offers easy exit routes. In many sections, the rock drops directly into the water with no shore to speak of, and the routes out of the inner canyon are long, technical, and in late November, cold. If Glenn and Bessie had left the boat and attempted to walk out for any reason, the routes available to them were severe enough that experienced outdoors people would have treated them with serious caution. The search found nothing on the banks or the approach routes. The canyon returned no bodies, no clothing, no equipment that could be tied to them beyond what was already on the boat. Now this is where the case accumulates its strangeness in layers, because the years after 1928 generated a series of additional details that have never been resolved and deserve careful labeling. In 1976, nearly 5 decades after Glenn and Bessie disappeared, skeletal remains were discovered on the south rim of the canyon. Initial speculation naturally turned toward the hides. Forensic examination of the remains was conducted, and the conclusion was that the skeleton was not Glenn Hyde. The remains were not identified as either of the missing couple. That door, at least, closed, though what the 1,976 skeleton represented, and whose it was, is a separate question. The record does not appear to have answered cleanly. There is another layer, and it requires the clearest possible label. This is rumor, unverified, and should be treated accordingly. In later decades, a story circulated in river-running circles connecting a well-known Colorado River guide named Georgie Clark, a legendary figure in the world of Grand Canyon, boating to the disappearance of Bessie Hyde. The suggestion, advanced by some and dismissed by others, was that Georgie Clark and Bessie Hyde were the same person, that Bessie had survived the canyon by means that implicated Glenn's death, and that she had built an entirely new identity and life in the decades that followed. This story has never been confirmed by any evidence that meets a credible evidentiary standard. It remains a piece of Grand Canyon folklore, compelling, persistent, and unverifiable. It is included here because it is part of the documented history of how this case has been discussed, not because it has been established as true. The honest position is that no one knows what happened between River Mile 237 and the takeout at Needles in November 1928, and no one has ever produced evidence sufficient to close the question. 3 documented theories have circulated across the decades: a drowning accident, the most straightforward reading, troubled by the intact boat; foul play of some kind between the couple, with one or both perishing in the canyon as a result, a theory without supporting physical evidence; a deliberate walkout, an attempt to exit the canyon on foot for reasons that were never recorded and produced no survivor account. None of these closes cleanly. All of them leave the boat, sitting there in the river, fully loaded, waiting for people who never came back to it. The river gave back everything except the two people who trusted it. The next man to vanish here wore the badge that's supposed to save you. The 13th of January, 1980. Chiricahua National Monument, Arizona. There is a specific quality of silence in the Chiricahua Mountains that visitors either find deeply peaceful or faintly unsettling, depending on the kind of person they are. The monument sits in the far southeastern corner of Arizona, roughly 80 miles from the Mexican border, tucked into a corner of the state that most Americans could not locate on a map without help. It is not a place you pass through on the way to somewhere else. It does not sit adjacent to any major highway or tourist corridor. You go to Chiricahua because you intend to go to Chiricahua. And once you are there, the nearest city of any size is far enough away that the distance registers as a physical presence, a kind of buffer between this place and the infrastructure most people take for granted. The monument itself covers approximately 12,000 acres of terrain that its early promoters called the Wonderland of Rocks, an apt description for a landscape of towering volcanic rhyolite columns, balanced boulders, and deep canyon drainages carved by millions of years of erosion into formations that look, in the right light, like something assembled by a deliberate and slightly deranged hand. The trails wind through this terrain in ways that are beautiful and genuinely disorienting. The rock columns create corridors and dead ends and sightlines that shift constantly as you move through them, so that a place you were certain you could navigate by memory has a way of becoming unfamiliar from a slightly different angle. Rangers who work there know the terrain with the particular intimacy that comes from years of daily presence. Visitors encounter it for the first time and feel its scale in ways they don't fully anticipate until they are already inside it. Paul Braxton Fugate was 41 years old, and he was not a visitor. He was a ranger, a naturalist, and law enforcement officer who wore the National Park Service uniform and the arrowhead patch, and knew this specific landscape in the professional, granular way that his job required. He was physically distinctive: brown beard, shoulder-length ponytail, the kind of appearance that stood out in the context of a federal uniform and apparently suited a man who, by various accounts, had a complicated relationship with institutional authority while simultaneously working within it. He lived in a cabin on the monument grounds. He knew the trail system. He knew the terrain's habits and moods in different seasons, different weather conditions, different times of day. He wore Red Wing boots, good, sturdy footwear, the kind a working ranger selects for durability on real terrain, and a green parka, appropriate for a January afternoon in the high desert, where the temperature drops fast once the sun starts moving toward the ridgeline. He was, in every relevant sense, the person in this landscape least likely to get into serious trouble without anyone noticing. Here's the critical detail about the afternoon of January 13th. It was a Sunday. The monument was quiet in the way that remote parks in the Southwest are quiet on winter Sundays. Minimal visitor traffic, a skeleton staff, the kind of reduced activity level that makes a ranger's routine movements less visible than they would be on a busy summer weekend. Around 2 in the afternoon, Paul left the visitor center area to check on a nature trail in the faraway ranch vicinity, a short, routine errand of the kind that ranger staff perform dozens of times per week without incident. The operational equivalent of walking down the hall to look at something and coming back in 20 minutes. There was nothing in the stated purpose of the outing that warranted special attention or a scheduled check-in time. He was a trained law enforcement ranger in terrain he knew professionally. The trail he was going to look at was not remote backcountry. The distance involved was not the kind that required logistical planning. He left the visitor center in the early afternoon on a clear winter day in country he had spent years learning, carrying the professional equipment and wearing the professional clothing that his job provided, and he did not come back by evening. The escalation from concern to formal search happened quickly once it became clear he was overdue. Rangers and search and rescue teams were deployed across the monument's trail system and the surrounding terrain, working the nature trail corridor and the faraway ranch area first, then expanding outward as the inner search zones came back empty. Helicopters ran passes over the rhyolite columns and the canyon drainages, where the terrain folds in ways that can conceal a person even from the air. Ground teams worked the broken rock country methodically, following the trails and then moving off them into the untracked terrain between the formal routes, covering the arroyos and the boulder fields, and the drainage corridors that connect the monument's various sections. Dogs were brought in to work scent trails from the visitor center and the ranch area, attempting to establish which direction Paul had moved and how far he had gone. The search covered approximately 20 square miles of terrain over days and then weeks of sustained effort, deploying every resource that Cochise County and the National Park Service could bring to bear on the problem. They found nothing, not a boot print, not a scrap of green parka fabric caught on the volcanic rock, not a personal item, not a piece of equipment, not anything that had been part of Paul Fugate's kit on the afternoon of January 13th. A trained ranger who knew this terrain well enough to have guided visitors through it professionally, who was dressed appropriately for the conditions, who had gone to check on a trail he had almost certainly walked dozens of times before, left the visitor center area, and ceased to exist in any documentable sense from that point forward. He is, according to the research on this case, the only National Park Service ranger in the history of the agency to go missing in the line of duty and never be found. That distinction is not a minor one. The National Park Service has extensive resources and institutional motivation to account for its own people. The fact that those resources applied to a 12,000-acre monument with a known trail system and a search zone of roughly 20 square miles produced nothing at all is the kind of result that forces you to sit with the question of what, exactly, happened in the Chiricahua Rock Country on a quiet Sunday afternoon in January. Now this is where the case turns dark in a specific and carefully labeled way. Chiricahua National Monument sits approximately 80 miles north of the Mexican border, in a corridor that has a documented history of smuggling activity, both narcotics and human trafficking, moving through remote terrain in southeastern Arizona. This is not speculation or atmosphere. It is a documented operational reality that law enforcement agencies in Cochise County and the surrounding region have dealt with for decades. And it was an operational reality in 1980 as well. A ranger working a remote monument in that specific corridor on a quiet winter Sunday with minimal staff presence and minimal visitor traffic, moving alone through terrain that could conceal movement in multiple directions, was operating in a context that the smuggling corridor geography made complicated in ways it would not have been in a different park, in a different region. Here's the critical detail about what the investigation found, or rather, what it found around the edges. Inside Paul's cabin on the monument grounds, investigators located an unfinished life insurance application. It was noted in accounts of the case. It was not, by itself, proof of anything. People leave unfinished paperwork in their homes for 1,000 different reasons that have nothing to do with their disappearance. A form set aside to complete later. An administrative task that hadn't risen to the top of a busy week. The ordinary accumulation of things not yet done that characterizes most people's living spaces. The presence of an incomplete life insurance application in a missing person's home is a detail, not evidence. And it is included here, with that label clearly attached. What it proves about Paul Fugate's state of mind or intentions on January 13th is exactly nothing. What it did was generate a question that investigators could not dismiss entirely, because questions without definitive answers have a way of persisting in cases where everything else has also refused to resolve. There is a second investigative gap that deserves acknowledgement with equal care. By some accounts, Paul's wife was not interviewed by investigators for several days after his disappearance was reported, and the family home was not searched immediately. These are documented gaps in the early investigative response, noted in materials examining the case. They are included here as facts about the investigation's conduct, not as implications about any individual. The absence of something from an investigation's early phase tells you about the investigation, about its priorities, and its blind spots in that opening window, without necessarily telling you anything definitive about people connected to the case. This distinction matters, and it should be maintained. The reward offered for information leading to a resolution of Paul Fugate's disappearance has been increased over the years. By 2018, according to reporting on the case, it stood at $60,000, a figure that reflects decades of sustained interest from the people who have continued to work this case and have continued to believe that the answer exists somewhere in the documented world. waiting to be surfaced by the right piece of information from the right person who has been sitting on it for reasons of their own. $60,000 is a serious reward. The fact that it has not produced a resolution after more than 4 decades is its own kind of statement about how completely this case has refused to close. The 2 dominant theories that investigators and researchers have circulated over the years are these: that Paul Fugate encountered something in the Chiricahua backcountry that day, a smuggling operation moving through the monument's terrain, individuals who could not afford to be seen by a law enforcement ranger, and that the encounter ended badly for him in a way that left no physical evidence the subsequent search could locate. The second theory is voluntary disappearance, that Paul chose to walk away from his life for reasons that were entirely his own, moving out of the monument and out of his documented existence through a corridor that the terrain and the geography made plausible. Neither theory has ever been supported by evidence sufficient to elevate it above the status of theory. No individual has ever been accused of involvement in his disappearance. No confirmed sighting of Paul Fugate after the 13th of January, 1980, exists in any source. The research on this case has produced, but here's what doesn't make sense about either explanation. A ranger who chose to walk away from his life would be walking away from terrain. He knew better than almost anyone terrain that offers specific routes out, specific corridors to roads and the wider world beyond the monument boundary. A motivated, informed person making a deliberate exit could do it without leaving a trace the search teams found. That much is physically possible, but a person who was harmed in those canyons, in country that a 20-square-mile search covered over weeks with dogs and helicopters and ground teams, and left nothing behind at all, not a boot, not a fragment of green parka. Not any physical object represents a different and more troubling category of thoroughness. The desert in southeastern Arizona, in winter, is not forgiving terrain. It does not absorb things gently. It tends, over time, to surface what has been left in it. The Chiricahua rock country has, by all available evidence, not surfaced anything that belonged to Paul Fugate in 44 years. A ranger whose whole job was finding the lost and no one could find him. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. There are files here that go places most channels won't touch. The next runner was found a year later, a few hundred yards from where they'd already searched. The 23rd of July, 2015, Conejos County, Colorado. There is a particular cruelty embedded in cases where the search is thorough, sustained, and ultimately unsuccessful, and then the answer turns up anyway. A year later, in terrain the searchers had already covered. It is a cruelty that operates on everyone involved, on the family, who spent 12 months not knowing while the answer sat in a canyon they had already walked through, on the search teams, who did everything the evidence and the resources and the professional protocols asked of them and still walked past it, and on the case itself, which resolves in a way that should feel like closure but produces instead a specific, uncomfortable silence. Finding out what happened is supposed to end the worst part. In cases like this one, it doesn't, because the gap between "we searched that area" and "we found him there a year later" generates its own set of questions that the discovery doesn't answer. It just adds them to the file. Joe Keller was 19 years old, from Cleveland, Tennessee, a college athlete and swim coach, with a faith that was, by the accounts of people who knew him, not incidental to who he was, but genuinely central to it. He was the kind of young man whose character was described consistently and specifically by the people around him. Disciplined, warm, devoted to the people in his life. Someone who showed up in the way that makes other people feel seen. He had spent the summer working at Rainbow Trout Ranch, a Christian dude ranch operating in the remote San Juan mountain terrain of Conejos County in southern Colorado. Seasonal work of the kind that draws young people who are comfortable in wild places and want their summer to mean something beyond a paycheck. The ranch sits in high country, the San Juans rising around it in the particular combination of beauty and severity that defines southern Colorado's mountain terrain. Steep drainages, cliff country, high desert transitions, elevation changes that move fast and dramatically across short horizontal distances. It is gorgeous and it is serious, and people who spend summers there develop a specific physical familiarity with the landscape that comes from living inside it daily, rather than passing through it as visitors. On the afternoon of the 23rd of July 2015, Joe went for a run. His best friend and fellow ranch staffer, Colin Gwaltney, went with him. This was not an unusual thing. The two of them ran together regularly, the way athletes do when they're in a place with good terrain, and have the kind of friendship that makes shared physical effort feel easy. They set out together on a route in the vicinity of the ranch, moving through the high country landscape at the pace the afternoon allowed. After approximately a quarter of a mile, the two of them split up, not in any alarming or deliberate way, but in the organic, low-stakes way that happens between runners of different paces and different preferences on a shared route. Colin was moving at his pace. Joe was moving at his. They agreed to meet back at the ranch for dinner, which was the kind of casual, sensible arrangement that people make dozens of times in the course of a summer, without any of those arrangements becoming significant. Colin headed back toward the ranch. Joe continued on his route, and that's the last confirmed time anyone saw Joe Keller alive. When dinner came and Joe didn't, the initial response moved through the stages that anyone who has spent time in outdoor settings would recognize. A check of the obvious places he might be, a round of calls and messages that didn't connect, a growing unease as the plausible explanations for his absence started running out one by one. Friends searched the immediate area around the ranch while there was still light to search by. When the light ran out and Joe hadn't come back, the search became formal. Rangers contacted, search and rescue protocols activated. The infrastructure of a missing person operation in remote Colorado terrain beginning to assemble itself around a 19-year-old who had gone out for an afternoon jog and not come home to dinner. The FBI was consulted in the early phase of the investigation, which is a specific and notable detail. It indicates that investigators were not treating this as a simple case of a hiker getting lost on familiar terrain, that the possibility of foul play was being taken seriously from an early point, rather than being set aside while the search focused exclusively on accident scenarios. Here's the critical detail about what the search involved. The terrain around Rainbow Trout Ranch and Forest Service Road 250 is not gentle country. The San Juan Mountains in Conejos County present the kind of landscape that defeats search efforts, not through sheer scale alone, but through topographic complexity, cliff faces, steep drainage walls, boulder-choked creek bottoms, terrain features that are invisible from above and approached only with difficulty from the sides. A search helicopter flying a grid pattern over this country can cover the visible surfaces systematically, but what lies below the cliff faces and inside the drainage channels requires ground teams with the physical ability to get into those spaces, which takes time and carries its own risks. Dogs were deployed. Drones were used where the technology could reach. Ground teams worked systematically through the terrain in expanding zones outward from the ranch and the route Joe and Colin had shared before splitting. A reward was established early on to encourage information from anyone in the area who might have seen something relevant. It began at $10,000 and was eventually increased to $50,000, a figure that reflects both the family's resources and their absolute determination not to let the search close without an answer. The search continued at sustained intensity for weeks before the combination of terrain, weather, and the complete absence of any physical evidence pointing forward forced the operational decision to scale back. Joe had not been found. The search had not produced the physical lead that would have changed what happened next. It was suspended without a resolution. Now this is where the case turns in the specific direction that makes it so hard to sit with. On the 6th of July 2016, approximately 12 months after Joe Keller went out for a run and did not come back, his remains were located near Forest Service Road 250, approximately 4 miles west of Colorado State Highway 17. The location was at the base of a cliff face, in terrain consistent with a fall from height, an 800 to 1,000-foot vertical feature that sits in the drainage country west of the ranch corridor. The Conejos County coroner examined the remains and determined a cause of death consistent with an accidental fall, with skull fracture as a documented finding. The ruling was accidental. But here's what doesn't make sense, and it is the part of this case that the ruling doesn't fully quiet. The area where Joe's remains were found had reportedly been within the search zone during the original operation. Searchers had come within several hundred yards of the location during the sustained multi-week effort in the summer of 2015. The terrain and the vegetation and the cliff-based geography had been covered closely enough that the gap between covered and where he actually was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. That gap is not large in absolute terms. In terms of what it means for the families and the teams who searched this country for 12 months without finding what was there, it is enormous. The question of how a search of that intensity, in a zone that included the area where Joe was ultimately found, did not surface his remains for a full year, is one that the resolution of the case does not fully answer. Search operations in broken cliff terrain operate under constraints that experienced search and rescue professionals understand. The base of a cliff face in a drainage channel is exactly the kind of location that can be within radar of a systematic search and still not be visually accessible without descending into the drainage and examining it from within, which is slow, difficult, and dangerous work. The answer may be entirely consistent with the practical realities of how cliff country search operations function. It does not make the gap less uncomfortable to sit with. His clothing was reportedly intact when he was found, and there was no evidence of predation consistent with wildlife activity details that, in the absence of other evidence, point toward a relatively sheltered final location rather than open terrain exposure. What they cannot tell anyone is whether Joe's death was instantaneous or otherwise, whether he came to rest at the base of that cliff in the first minutes after his run diverged from Colin's route, or at some later point in a sequence no one can reconstruct, is officially unknown and may remain so. The coroner's ruling establishes mechanism and manner. It does not establish the full sequence of events between the moment Colin turned back toward the ranch and the moment Joe's run ended at the base of a 1,000-foot cliff face 4 miles west of the highway. The lingering questions around foul play, the questions that prompted FBI consultation in the early phase and that circulated in the community throughout the year of searching, were never fully and formally closed. By the accidental ruling in the way that such questions close when there is positive evidence, rather than an absence of contradicting evidence. An accident ruling in a case with incomplete physical evidence does not generate the same kind of closure as a positive case built on affirmative findings. It answers the question it can answer with the evidence available, and leaves the rest in the category of unknown. That is not a criticism of the investigation or the coroner. It is a description of where the case sits. What is known is this: a 19-year-old athlete went for an afternoon run in country he knew, split from his friend at a quarter-mile mark in the most ordinary way imaginable, and came to rest at the base of a cliff in a drainage that searchers spent 12 months looking for him without finding. The search that eventually located him was not a new operation. It was the terrain itself, or time, or some combination of conditions that eventually made visible what a year of sustained effort had not. The $50,000 reward, the FBI consultation, the weeks of dogs and drones and ground teams working systematically through the San Juan backcountry, all of it, ultimately, was not what found Joe Keller. A year's worth of time and geography did. They found him where they'd already looked, which somehow made it worse. The next ones drove into the hottest place on Earth and simply never drove out. July 1996, Death Valley National Park, California. There is a thing that happens to people who are unfamiliar with the desert, and it is not stupidity, and it is not carelessness. It is a failure of scale that is almost impossible to correct for without prior experience. The desert does not look the way danger looks. Danger, in most environments that human beings evolved to navigate, presents itself with cues the body can read: a darkening sky, rising water, dropping temperature, thickening forest. The desert in midsummer presents itself as open, bright, comprehensible, a landscape you can see across for miles in every direction. The roads go where they appear to go. The terrain is visible. The distances look manageable in a way that the brain, without specific desert experience to override the default reading, accepts as accurate. The error in that reading is not apparent until it is too late to correct. Because the desert's lethality operates on a timeline that is completely invisible from the outside, it is already happening inside the body before any external sign announces it. and by the time the external signs are present, the margin for correction has typically already closed. Death Valley in July takes this dynamic and applies it at maximum intensity. It is the hottest place in North America. Air temperatures routinely exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit on the valley floor. Ground temperatures on exposed dark surfaces can reach 200 degrees or higher, hot enough to cause burns on contact, hot enough to cook the moisture out of anything resting against it within hours. The park covers more than 3.4 million acres of terrain, making it the largest national park in the contiguous United States. And the vast majority of that acreage is not the paved, ranger-patrolled corridor that visitors driving the main road experience. It is remote backcountry wash systems and canyon drainages and alluvial fans extending for miles in every direction from the valley floor, terrain that is geographically complex, navigationally demanding, and in midsummer, lethally hostile to anyone on foot without water, shelter, and a precise understanding of the distances involved. There is no water in that backcountry. There is no shade in any direction that matters beyond what the canyon walls provide for a few hours at the edges of the day. The terrain that looks crossable from a distance is, in the heat of a July afternoon, a different category of obstacle than it appears, and the distance between a vehicle that is running and a vehicle that is not is, in those conditions, the distance between a situation that is recoverable and one that is not. The family that drove into Death Valley in July of 1996 consisted of 4 people: a German man named Egbert Rimkus, his son Georg, a woman named Cornelia Meyer, and her son Max. They were tourists, German visitors to the American Southwest, doing what tourists in that corridor do, moving through the landscape in a rented vehicle, taking in the scale and the strangeness of terrain that has no European equivalent. Death Valley was, in 1996, as now, a place that drew international visitors, specifically because of its extremity. Its reputation as the hottest and driest place in North America was part of the attraction, the kind of superlative that makes a destination feel worth the detour. People drove into it every summer from all over the world, navigated its paved roads and its maintained viewpoints, and drove back out having experienced something genuinely unlike anything else. The infrastructure of the park, its visitor center, its paved main corridors, its ranger stations, exist to make that experience possible and, within limits, safe. What the park's infrastructure does not do, and cannot do, is make the backcountry safe. The roads that leave the maintained corridors and move into the remote interior of Death Valley are a different proposition, entirely unpaved, unmarked in the sense that matters most, leading into terrain where the distances to any help are measured in hours of driving on a good day, and where the margin for mechanical or navigational error is essentially zero in midsummer. These are roads that experienced desert travelers approach with specific preparation: extra water measured in gallons per person per day, high-clearance vehicles, communication equipment, a filed trip plan with someone who will notice if you don't return. The rented minivan that carried the Rimkus-Meyer family into the backcountry was none of those things. It was a standard passenger vehicle, the kind entirely appropriate for the paved network, and entirely unsuited to what the family drove it into. Here's the critical detail about what the family did. They drove off the maintained road network and into the backcountry. Exactly how far they went, and by which route, was not immediately known. They were tourists in a rented minivan, unfamiliar with the specific terrain, navigating in an era before the GPS mapping on personal devices that might have given them real-time information about where the maintained road network ended and the wash country began. What is known is that they drove significantly further into the backcountry than the vehicle was suited for into terrain, where the sandy wash bottoms and the rocky surfaces that pass for roads in the deep desert become impassable for standard passenger vehicles without high clearance and four-wheel drive. This is the kind of terrain where a minivan bogs down and stops moving, and the options for what to do next collapse very quickly in 120-degree heat. There is no calling for a tow truck. There is no flagging down a passing car. There is only the heat, the stillness, the distance back to any maintained road, and whatever water is left in the vehicle. At some point, the minivan became immobilized in the backcountry. It was found later, months later, by a ranger, sitting deep in the desert well off any maintained road, the family's belongings still inside it. The vehicle abandoned in the way vehicles are abandoned when the people who drove them have left on foot, because staying with the vehicle was no longer viable. This is where it stops being normal. The family was not reported missing immediately in any way that generated a rapid, large-scale search response in the summer of 1996. The timeline of when their absence was formally registered and when a structured search effort was mounted is not detailed in the available sources with the precision that would allow a confident reconstruction of those early days. What is clear is that the formal search did not produce the family, and that for 13 years from 1996 until 2009, the case remained in a state of suspended uncertainty, with the abandoned van as essentially the only confirmed physical evidence of where the family had been and what had happened to them. 13 years. In that period, the family was listed as missing, the case remained open, and the desert held what it had taken in July of 1996 without returning it to anyone looking in the right places with the right methods. Now this is where the case turns in the direction that makes it genuinely strange as a missing persons investigation. The breakthrough, when it came, did not come from an official search operation. It came from two private individuals, Tom Mahood and Les Walker, off-duty search and rescue specialists, who had become absorbed in the case and committed, on their own time and with their own resources, to reconstructing what had happened to the family. What they did, methodically and over significant time, was attempt to reverse engineer the family's route from the abandoned van to trace the most plausible walking corridor available to 4 people on foot in Death Valley backcountry in July, carrying whatever water and supplies they had been able to take from the van, moving in whatever direction seemed most likely to lead toward help or water or both. This kind of route reconstruction in desert terrain requires a specific combination of skills: knowledge of the landscape's topology, understanding of how people in distress make navigational decisions under heat stress and dehydration, and familiarity with the particular way Death Valley's washes and canyon systems channel movement and limit options. Mahood and Walker had those skills, and they applied them to the problem with a rigor that the official investigation, whatever its scope and resources, had not managed to translate into a physical result. Their reconstruction led them to skeletal remains presumed to be those of Cornelia Meyer in terrain consistent with the walking route their analysis had identified as the most plausible exit corridor from the van's location. This was the first physical evidence recovered in 13 years of an open case, located through private analysis and fieldwork rather than official search operations. It was, in the context of a case that had produced nothing for over a decade, an extraordinary result. It was also a partial one. The remains recovered were not sufficient to account for all 4 members of the family, and the full picture of what happened to Egbert Rimkus, Georg Rimkus, and Max Meyer in the days after the van became immobilized in the Death Valley backcountry remains incompletely documented in the available public record. But here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here is the set of facts that the partial resolution leaves standing without a clean answer. 4 people on foot in Death Valley in July, walking away from a broken-down vehicle, had essentially no margin for error. The nearest maintained road, the nearest ranger station, the nearest source of water, any of those destinations, in that heat, represented a walking distance that human physiology in peak condition would find extremely challenging. And the family was not in peak desert survival condition. They were tourists. They did not have desert survival training. They did not have the specific physiological adaptation that comes from spending extended time in extreme heat environments. Whatever water they carried from the van had a finite duration. In conditions where the body's cooling demands in 120-degree air are enormous demands that accelerate dehydration at a rate most people have no intuitive reference point for. A physically fit adult in those conditions, walking in full sun, can require a liter of water per hour simply to maintain basic function. The direction they chose to walk and how far they got, and in what sequence the 4 of them came to rest in the desert. These questions remain only partially answered by the evidence Mahood and Walker's private investigation recovered. The desert held 3 of them through 13 years of official search operations and did not release them to those searches. It yielded 1 set of remains to 2 people who approached the problem from a different angle, with different methods. And it has not yielded the rest. The thing about Death Valley that visitors reading the park's informational materials understand in principle, but sometimes fail to fully internalize, is that the desert does not pursue you. It does not chase. It simply sits there in its heat and its silence and its enormous, indifferent distance, and allows the consequences of the decisions made inside it to play out at whatever pace the physics demand. The family drove into it in July of 1996 in a rented minivan, with the ordinary intentions of tourists who wanted to see something extraordinary. The van stopped moving at some point in the backcountry. They got out and walked, and the desert, which had been waiting with the patience of terrain that measures time in geological epochs rather than human generations, kept them. There is a specific detail in this case that tends to land hardest when people sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. The van was found by a ranger in the months following the family's disappearance, sitting in the backcountry with the family's belongings inside it, their luggage, their travel documents, the ordinary accumulated material of a vacation in progress. Somewhere in that vehicle were things that spoke to who the four of them were. Personal items, perhaps photographs from earlier stops on the trip, or belongings that belonged specifically to the two boys. The van sat in the desert heat for months before it was located, and then for years after, while the case remained open, while the family remained listed as missing, while the desert held what it held. The belongings waited in the heat for people who were not coming back to collect them. That image, an intact, packed vehicle, sitting in the backcountry with a family's vacation inside it, and no family is the one the case keeps returning to, because it captures the essential strangeness of what the desert does. It takes people cleanly, without drama, without any of the disruption that human disappearance usually leaves behind, and it sits there afterward, looking exactly the same as it did before. A family drove into the desert on vacation, and the desert kept them for over a decade. The next one was a little boy who treated the whole thing like a game. The 14th of October, 2006, Crater Lake National Park, Oregon. There is a specific kind of terrain that search and rescue professionals describe as worst case, and it is not always the terrain that looks most dangerous from the outside. The most visually dramatic landscapes, sheer cliff faces, churning whitewater, dense forest canopy at least present their hazards in ways that are legible, that allow searchers to say, here is where the edge is, here is where the current runs, here is the line that matters. Worst-case terrain is sometimes quieter than that. It is terrain that looks manageable, that does not announce its particular combination of hazards through dramatic visual cues, but that operates in ways that defeat the standard tools of a search operation: tracking dogs, aerial coverage, systematic ground sweep through a specific set of physical properties that are hard to counter once a person has entered them and stopped leaving sign. Crater Lake's cinder slopes are that kind of terrain. They are not, at first look, obviously terrible. The volcanic material that covers them fine, loose, unconsolidated looks like dark sand, like the kind of surface that would hold a footprint and yield evidence to a tracking team in the way that soft ground always does. It does not. Cinder and pumice, at the scale Crater Lake presents, it is a surface that swallows footprints as fast as they are made, shifts constantly underfoot in ways that destabilize even experienced hikers, and on steep grades transitions without warning from a manageable scramble to an uncontrolled slide. It is a surface that conceals where it has been disturbed almost as quickly as the disturbance occurs. Tracking dogs work on scent, not on visual sign, and scent dispersal on a steep, open, wind-exposed volcanic slope is not the controlled, readable thing. It is in the shelter of a forest or a canyon drainage. Aerial coverage can see the surface but not what is beneath it, and the cinder terrain around Crater Lake's caldera has depths and voids that the surface does not announce. The caldera itself is the other element. Crater Lake was formed approximately 7,700 years ago when the volcanic peak of Mount Mazama collapsed inward, leaving a caldera that filled over centuries with water to a depth of nearly 2,000 feet, making it the deepest lake in the United States and one of the deepest in the world. The water is a specific, extraordinary blue, the kind of color that does not look real in photographs and does not look entirely real in person either. A blue that comes from the lake's depth and clarity, and the complete absence of any inlet stream. It sits inside the collapsed volcano, surrounded by caldera walls that drop steeply to the water's edge. With a few access points, including the Cleetwood Cove Trail, the only maintained trail in the park that reaches the lake's surface. The terrain around the caldera rim and along the cinder slopes descending toward the water is steep, unstable, cold in October, and in certain sections, directly adjacent to drops that end at the lake or on the rocky margins above it. It is beautiful in the way that genuinely dangerous places are often beautiful compellingly, with a quality of attention-demanding stillness that makes you stop and look, and sometimes move closer than is wise. Sammy Bolka was 8 years old. He was hiking that day with his father, Kenneth, in the area near Cleetwood Cove, the section of the park where the cinder slopes descend toward the caldera and the lake sits below in its impossible blue. By accounts of the case, Sammy was on the autism spectrum, a detail that matters not as a diminishment of who he was, but as context for understanding the specific dynamic of what happened on that October afternoon, particularly the way he engaged with the landscape and with his father's attempts to redirect him when the day began to turn. He treated the outing with the particular quality of absorbed, self-directed engagement that characterized how he moved through the world. The hike was not, by the accounts available, a distressed or difficult outing up to the point where things changed. It was a father and son on a trail in a national park on an October afternoon, the kind of thing families do on fall weekends in the Pacific Northwest when the summer crowds have thinned and the park has a different, quieter quality than it carries in peak season. Here's the critical detail about what happened as the afternoon light began to drop. As the day moved toward evening and the temperature on the exposed slope began to fall, Kenneth told Sammy it was time to head back toward the car. This is the moment that every account of this case returns to, because it is the last documented interaction between the two of them, and because of the specific nature of Sammy's response. He didn't want to go. He was engaged with the terrain, with the game of being on the slope, with the particular quality of absorbed presence that the cinder hillside and the extraordinary lake below it had generated in him. He stayed ahead of his father on the slope, not running, not fleeing, but holding his position as the kind of playful resistance children deploy when they are not ready for an outing to end, keeping himself approximately 50 feet ahead of Kenneth and responding to the call to turn back with the body language of a child who is still playing. 50 feet, approximately the length of a school bus. That is the distance between Sammy Bolka and his father at the last moment Kenneth could confirm his son's position on that slope. Kenneth turned toward the car, whether momentarily or for a longer interval, is not specified in the available sources with certainty. And when he looked back at the slope, Sammy was not there. And that's the last confirmed time anyone saw him. The terrain immediately around the point of disappearance is the thing that gives this case its specific texture of dread, because it does not offer the explanatory framework that most disappearances eventually provide. Sammy vanished from an open slope, not from inside dense forest, not from a trail that entered a canyon and became inaccessible, not from terrain where the visual horizon was limited to a few yards in any direction. He was on a cinder hillside in sight of his father, 50 feet away, in the late afternoon light of a clear October day, doing what children do when they are half playing and half resisting the end of an outing. There was no moment of obvious danger. There was no edge he ran toward, no dramatic visual event that Kenneth witnessed and registered as the transition from present to absent. He was there, and then, when Kenneth looked back, he was not. The cinder slope was empty in the specific, unambiguous way that makes a parent's brain refuse the information for a moment before it becomes unavoidable. The search that followed was immediate and substantial. Ground teams deployed onto the cinder slopes and the surrounding terrain as quickly as resources could be assembled, working in the failing light of that October evening and then through the night with whatever illumination the operation could maintain. Dogs were brought in to work the scent corridors available to them on a wind-exposed volcanic slope, a challenging assignment for the reasons already noted. The loose cinder and the open exposure creating scent dispersal conditions that are among the most difficult for tracking work. Aerial coverage was applied as soon as the morning light allowed it. running passes over the caldera rim and the slopes descending toward the water, looking for any sign of a small figure on the terrain or any disturbance in the cinder consistent with a child's passage. The search expanded as the days passed, and the inner zones continued to come back empty, moving outward from the Cleetwood Cove area, along the caldera rim and into the surrounding backcountry, covering the terrain on both the accessible and the difficult sides of the slopes. The combination of cinder footing, cold temperatures, the proximity of the caldera edge, and the complete absence of any physical sign moving forward from the point of disappearance made the operation one of the most technically frustrating searches in the park's history. Now this is where the case confronts you with a specific impossibility. The slope where Sammy disappeared is not a vast wilderness. It is not the 522,000 acres of the Smokies or the 3.4 million acres of Death Valley. It is a defined section of terrain on the interior wall of a volcanic caldera. Steep, yes, and footing challenging, and wind exposed in ways that complicate tracking, but geographically bounded in a way that should, in principle, make an intensive search either find a person or confirm that the person is not on the surface of that terrain. The search did neither. It did not find Sammy Bolka anywhere on the slopes or the rim or the accessible margins of the caldera. It did not produce a result that confirmed he had gone into the lake, though the proximity of the caldera to the terrain where he disappeared made that a possibility the searchers had to operate with from the beginning. It found nothing that moved the case forward, no clothing, no footwear, no disturbed terrain that pointed in any specific direction, no trace of a child's passage across the cinder that the search teams could follow to a result. The volcanic material swallowed whatever sign there might have been as thoroughly as if the slope had been swept behind him. But here's what doesn't make sense, in the way that it keeps not making sense, no matter how many times you turn it. Sammy was 50 feet away from his father. In the time it takes to turn around and look back at something in the duration of whatever brief interval passed between Kenneth last seeing his son and Kenneth turning back to find him, gone, a child vanished from an open slope in a bounded piece of terrain in a national park, and nothing found him. Not the search operation, not the years of subsequent investigation, not any hiker or ranger who has walked those slopes in the 18 years since the 14th of October 2006. Crater Lake holds its depth record and its caldera silence, and whatever it took from that slope on that October afternoon with equal indifference. The lake's extraordinary blue surface has not yielded anything. The cinder slopes have not offered any sign. The case remains open. Sammy Bolke remains listed as missing, and the Crater Lake terrain looks exactly the same from the rim overlooks as it always has, beautiful, bounded, and completely opaque about what it does with the people who disappear into it. There is a specific detail about the caldera's depth that tends to surface in discussions of this case, and it deserves acknowledgement without over-dramatization. At nearly 2,000 feet, Crater Lake is a body of water that has, in documented history, not returned the things that have entered it in the ways that shallower lakes sometimes do. Its depth and its temperature create conditions that are different from the recovery environments that search and water operations typically work in. Whether Sammy Bolke is in that lake is officially unknown. Whether he came to rest somewhere in the terrain below the rim that the search did not access is officially unknown. The case sits in the category where the most honest answer to every forward question is, we don't know, and the terrain has not told us. The volcano and the lake and the cinder slope took in what happened on the 14th of October, 2006, and have been silent about it since. 50 feet, the length of a school bus, is all the distance the mountain needed. The next hiker was a grown, capable adult who walked into a valley and out of the record. June 2005, Yosemite National Park, California, Tiltil Valley area, near Hetchy. There is a version of Yosemite that the vast majority of its 4 million annual visitors never see and never intend to see. The valley floor with its shuttle buses, its organized campgrounds, its cafeteria, and its gift shop, and its parking situation that has become one of the park's defining frustrations is genuinely spectacular. And it is also, in the most honest sense, a managed environment. The waterfalls are real. The granite walls are real. The scale is real. and does not require any inflation to be impressive. But the infrastructure surrounding the experience is dense enough that being in Yosemite Valley is not the same thing as being in wilderness. You are in a place with roads and cell coverage and ranger stations and a medical clinic and thousands of other people within earshot in every direction. The valley is safe in the way that heavily managed places are safe, not because the terrain is gentle, but because the human support structure surrounding it is thick enough to catch most of the mistakes people make inside it. The backcountry is different. Yosemite's backcountry covers hundreds of square miles of terrain that most visitors will never enter. Drainage systems and river corridors and forested valleys that see a fraction of the traffic the valley floor receives, that require permits and planning and a specific level of physical preparation, that are navigated by people who go there precisely because the support structure is absent and the wilderness is real. Tiltil Valley is that kind of place. It sits in the northern reaches of the park, in the Hetch Hetchy region, a part of Yosemite that carries its own complicated history and its own specific remoteness. The terrain more demanding, and the visitor numbers dramatically lower than anything in the southern and central sections of the park that draw the crowds. To reach Tiltil Valley requires commitment. It is not a destination you stumble into from a trailhead parking lot on a busy summer weekend. The approach involves miles of backcountry travel through terrain that changes character as you move north and west away from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, the forest thickening and the trail markers becoming less frequent, and the sense of being genuinely alone in a large wilderness becoming more pronounced with each mile. River crossings are real obstacles in that drainage country. The waterways that feed into the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir run through terrain that is dense and directionally confusing in ways that a topographic map describes accurately, but does not fully prepare you for at ground level, where the map's clean lines resolve into actual rock and actual water moving at actual speed. It is the kind of backcountry that rewards people who know what they are doing and that operates on an entirely different set of terms for people who overestimate their preparation or underestimate the terrain's specific demands. Michael Fissery was, by all available accounts, someone who knew what he was doing. He was approximately 50 years old. The exact age varies across sources, and the precise figure should be treated as approximate, and he was an experienced solo backpacker, the kind of outdoorsman whose competence in wilderness settings was not incidental or recent, but built over years of serious independent travel in demanding terrain. He was not a weekend hiker who had decided to push into backcountry above his skill level. He was not unfamiliar with Yosemite or with the specific demands of multi-day solo travel in remote terrain. He carried a backcountry permit, which means his intended route and his expected return date were part of the official record information logged with the park's permit system, specifically so that a search response can be triggered when a solo traveler fails to check out on time. That system exists because experienced people and park managers alike understand that solo backcountry travel in terrain, this remote, carries a specific category of risk that has nothing to do with the traveler's skill level. The permit is not a formality. It is an acknowledgement that things can go wrong in these drainages in ways that no amount of experience fully insulates against, and that the difference between a fatal outcome and a recoverable one can be whether anyone knows to start looking and when. Michael filed his permit. He went in with the preparation that experienced backcountry travelers carry. Knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of his own capabilities, the equipment appropriate for a multi-day solo route in the northern Yosemite backcountry in early summer. Here's the critical detail about what the official record holds and what it doesn't. The exact date of Michael Fissery's entry into the backcountry in June 2005 is not confirmed in the publicly available sources with the precision that would allow a day-by-day reconstruction of his movements. What the record holds is that he went into the Tiltil Valley area on a solo backcountry trip, that he failed to return by his expected exit date, and that the permit system caught the discrepancy and triggered a search response. A reported sighting or trace of his gear along his route exists in some accounts of the case, a detail that suggests he reached at least part of his intended corridor before the trail goes cold. But this detail is not confirmed across all sources with sufficient consistency to build a confident reconstruction around it. The honest label for it is reported but not fully verified, and it is included here with that label clearly attached. What it suggests, if accurate, is that he was alive and moving on his intended route at some point into the trip, that the disappearance did not happen at the trailhead or in the first miles of travel, but somewhere deeper in the drainage system, in terrain that was already well past the reach of a casual search. What is confirmed is the search itself. The Yosemite backcountry search for Michael Fissery was a substantial operation. Rangers and search and rescue personnel moving through the Tiltil Valley drainage and the surrounding terrain, working the route corridors available to a solo backpacker on his permitted path, covering the river crossings and the drainage channels and the forested sections of the northern backcountry that his route would have taken him through. The river crossings in that section of the park deserve specific attention in the context of a June search, because June in the Yosemite backcountry is not the same month it is in most of the continental United States. Snowmelt in the Sierra Nevada runs heaviest in late spring and early summer, and the waterways feeding the Hetchy drainage in June can be running at volumes and velocities that are dramatically higher than what a late-season visitor would encounter on the same routes. A crossing that is a routine ford in August can be a genuinely serious obstacle in June, faster, deeper, with a current that does not allow for error and that will move a person downstream faster than they can arrest the movement if their footing fails at the wrong moment. An experienced backpacker assessing those crossings knows this and adjusts accordingly, waiting for early morning when the melt-driven flow is at its lowest, using trekking poles for stability, reading the water's surface for information about depth and current speed. An experienced backpacker can also encounter a crossing that has surged overnight, that looks manageable at the bank and becomes something different at the midpoint, in a location where no one will see what happens, and no one will be in a position to help within any useful time frame. Aircraft were used to cover the terrain from above, where the forest canopy and the topography allowed meaningful aerial observation. The search worked outward from the confirmed elements of his route, the permit record, the reported trace into the surrounding terrain, where a deviation from his planned path might have taken him, covering the most plausible accident scenarios first, and then expanding into lower probability corridors as the primary zones came back empty. Ground teams worked the drainage channels that a river accident would most plausibly deposit evidence into, moving downstream from the crossing points on his route and examining the margins and the slower water sections where carried objects tend to ground out. They found nothing that allowed the case to move forward. Now, this is where the case asks you to sit with a specific and uncomfortable truth about wilderness experience. Competence does not confer immunity. This is not a cynical or defeatist observation. It is a documented operational reality that search and rescue professionals in wilderness environments understand and work with every season. An experienced solo backpacker in demanding terrain has a dramatically reduced probability of making the kind of elementary navigational or preparedness errors that account for many wilderness fatalities. They know how to read terrain. They know how to manage their water and their caloric needs. They know when conditions are deteriorating and how to respond to that deterioration in ways that a less experienced person would not. What experience does not provide is protection against the category of event that does not announce itself. The river crossing that runs higher and faster than the gauge reading suggested it would. The section of trail above a drainage that gives way underfoot without warning. The combination of factors that produces a fatal outcome in a location that is not the kind of place a careful, experienced person would identify in advance as a serious hazard. These events happen to experienced people precisely because experienced people go into the places where they can happen. The backcountry filters for skill and preparation and then applies its own criteria independently of both. But here's what doesn't make sense. In the specific way that makes experienced hiker disappearances so difficult to sit with. When an inexperienced person goes into demanding terrain and does not come back, the narrative has a certain tragic coherence, a mismatch between preparation and environment that the outcome reflects. When an experienced person goes into terrain they have the skills to navigate and does not come back, the narrative loses that coherence entirely. It forces a harder question. Not, what did they do wrong? Because the answer to that question may be nothing at all. But what did the terrain do that was not predictable from any external position, including their own? The northern Yosemite backcountry in June is a specific enough environment, and the gap between what it looks like from outside and what it demands from inside, that this question does not resolve into a comfortable answer. The river crossings are part of it. The remoteness from any rescue infrastructure is part of it. The simple fact that a solo traveler in that terrain who encounters a serious situation has no one to call and no one who will notice until the permit system flags the missed checkout is part of it. All of those elements were present on Michael Fissery's trip in June 2005, and none of them were unknown to him going in. He carried his permit and his experience and his preparation into terrain that demands all three, and apparently demanded something more besides. Michael Fissery remains listed as missing by the National Park Service. His case has not been formally closed with a confirmed cause of death or a confirmed location of remains. He is one of a number of people who have gone into the Yosemite backcountry with permits and experience and the full intention of coming back out and have not done so. Their cases sitting in the park's missing persons records as open files in an environment that is large enough and complex enough to hold its unresolved questions indefinitely. The Hetch Hetchy region and the Tiltil Valley drainage continue to receive backcountry visitors every season. People moving through the same terrain on their own permitted routes, crossing the same rivers and navigating the same drainage corridors. And the terrain does not mark what it has taken from the people who came before them. The trails do not look different. The river crossings do not announce their history. The northern backcountry holds its silence the way it holds everything else that has entered it, and not come back out completely, without drama, with the indifference of terrain that was here long before the permit system existed and will be here long after the files on every open case have yellowed past reading. Here is the honest accounting of what this case holds. An experienced solo backpacker entered a remote section of Yosemite's northern backcountry in June 2005 on a legitimate, permitted route, failed to exit by his planned date, triggered a search that was substantial and professionally executed, and has not been found. The cause of what happened to him is officially unknown. His location is officially unknown. The terrain that was most familiar to him, the kind of remote, demanding backcountry that experienced solo hikers seek out, specifically because it is real wilderness and not a managed experience, is the terrain that kept him. The wilderness he knew best is the one that held him. The last one was 70 years old, on a simple day hike, and even his car couldn't tell them where he'd gone. 2019. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. There is a particular image that appears at the beginning of almost every national park missing persons case, and it appears at the end of them too, and it is the same image both times, a car in a parking lot. At the beginning, it is an ordinary car in an ordinary lot, a vehicle left in the designated space the way park visitors leave their vehicles every single day. Keys in a pocket, doors locked. The small domestic rituals of securing a car before a hike completed, without any particular significance attaching to them. At the end, it is a different object entirely. It is a car that has been sitting in a lot for too long, that rangers have flagged because the lot closes and the vehicle hasn't moved, and the person who left it there has not come back to collect it. It is a car that becomes, in that transition from ordinary parked vehicle to evidence, the first confirmed data point in a missing persons case, the object that says, someone was here, someone left this, and that someone has not returned. The car in the lot is how many of these cases begin their formal existence as cases. It is the thing that triggers the head count, the radio call, the search authorization. It is, in the specific way that evidence works when everything else is absent, often the most important piece of information the investigation has, and also, paradoxically, one of the least informative, because it tells you where someone was, and nothing at all about where they went. James Pruitt was 70 years old in 2019, and he came to Rocky Mountain National Park for a day hike. This is the kind of sentence that contains its own normalcy so completely that it resists any attempt to make it sound like the opening of something terrible, because it shouldn't be. A 70-year-old on a day hike in one of America's most visited national parks, on a trail in terrain that the Park Service maintains and marks and manages for exactly this kind of visitor, is a completely ordinary thing. Rocky Mountain National Park receives approximately 4 million visitors per year. It has an extensive trail network that ranges from paved, accessible paths near the visitor center to serious high alpine routes that demand experience and preparation. The park sits at elevation Trail Ridge Road, which crosses the park, reaches over 12,000 feet above sea level, and its weather is famously fast-changing, the kind that transitions from clear and warm to cold and windy in the time it takes to reach a summit and turn around. But it is a managed park with ranger patrols and established search and rescue protocols and a trail infrastructure designed, at least in its lower and mid-elevation sections, to be navigable by the range of visitors who show up to walk it. People in their 70s hike in Rocky Mountain National Park without incident every single day of the season. It is not, in any objective sense, an extraordinary thing to do. The exact trailhead James Pruitt accessed that day in 2019 is not confirmed in the publicly available sources with sufficient specificity to state it here with confidence, and it will be labeled as such, rather than filled in with a placeholder. What is confirmed is that he arrived at the park, left his vehicle in a parking area, and set out on a day hike, a route intended to be completed within a single day, without overnight equipment, without the logistical preparation of a multi-day backcountry trip. Day hikers in national parks operate within a specific risk profile that is different from backpackers entering remote wilderness. They are expected to be closer to the trailhead infrastructure, closer to other hikers on popular routes, and closer to the kinds of ranger presence and visitor density that make a problem detectable faster than it would be in true backcountry. The day hike framing matters here because it shapes the initial response when a day hiker fails to return to a parking lot. The search zone is theoretically more bounded than when a backpacker fails to exit from a multi-day permitted route. The trailhead is known. The expected return time is roughly knowable. The car in the lot is the anchor point from which the search radiates outward. Here's the critical detail about what the car in James Pruitt's case actually told investigators. It told them he had been there. It told them he had left the vehicle and gone onto the trail. It did not tell them which specific direction he had taken, if the route offered any branching, how far he had gone before something went wrong, what time he had set out or turned around, or if he ever turned around at all. A parked car with no note, no trail register entry confirmed, no witness account of seeing the hiker at a specific point on a specific trail at a specific time, and no communication device that transmitted his location before something happened, is evidence of presence and nothing beyond it. The car is the beginning of the search corridor, not the guide through it. In terrain as varied and as topographically complex as Rocky Mountain National Park, where the elevation changes are dramatic, the weather is genuinely fast-changing, and the trail network branches in ways that a day hiker moving without GPS tracking can navigate in several different directions without anyone having a record of which choice was made. A parked car at a trailhead establishes a radius and leaves everything within that radius equally possible. It is a starting point that does not point. The search that was mounted for James Pruitt was serious and sustained. Rocky Mountain National Park has a well-resourced search and rescue operation, and a missing person, particularly an older day hiker who has not returned to their vehicle, triggers a response that takes the situation at face value from the beginning, rather than waiting to see if the person turns up on their own. Ground teams were deployed onto the trail network accessible from his parking area, working outward from the trailhead in systematic patterns, calling his name at intervals, looking for any sign of recent passage that the trail surface could provide. The park's high alpine terrain creates specific search challenges that differ from the forested or desert environments that defined earlier cases in this file. Above the tree line, the exposed rock and tundra surfaces hold less sign than softer ground. Wind moves through without interruption and carries both scent and sound in ways that make dog work and voice contact less reliable. And the weather that arrives fast and hard at elevation can erase whatever a hiker left behind in the terrain quickly enough that a search beginning hours after a disappearance is already working degraded evidence. The Rockies in the late hiking season and 2019 specific conditions at the time of Pruitt's disappearance are not detailed in the available sources with the precision that would allow a confident weather characterization. Can be unforgiving in the way that high-altitude environments everywhere are unforgiving. The consequences of being caught unprepared at elevation in deteriorating conditions escalate faster than they do at lower altitude. and they escalate faster for older hikers whose physiological reserves and thermoregulatory capacity operate on different margins than they do for younger adults. Now this is where the case confronts the same impossible gap that has appeared in every file in this document, arriving this time in the form most stripped of drama and most resistant to any kind of sensational framing. James Pruitt was a 70-year-old man on a day hike in a national park. There is nothing exotic about this. There is no unusual configuration of circumstances, no extreme terrain choice, no behavioral detail that sets this case apart from the ordinary in any way that makes its outcome feel inevitable in retrospect. He did what millions of people do in national parks every year. He parked his car, he walked into the park, and he did not come back. The searches that followed multiple operations, returning to the terrain as weather and resources allowed, did not find him. The high alpine terrain of Rocky Mountain National Park, with its exposed rock and its fast-moving weather systems and its dramatic elevation changes, defeated the search operation in the way that demanding terrain defeats search operations, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of conditions that make finding a person who does not want to be found or who cannot signal where they are progressively harder with each passing hour and each weather system that moves through. But here's what doesn't make sense, in the specific way that makes this the hardest kind of case to sit with. The hardest cases are not the ones where the terrain is extreme and the risk is obvious, and the person who went in was pushing the limits of what any reasonable preparation could protect against. The hardest cases are the ones where the setting is ordinary, the decision was reasonable, and the outcome is nevertheless a car in a lot, a name on a missing persons list, multiple searches that came back empty, a file that stays open because the terrain has not provided anything that would allow it to close. James Pruitt was not attempting the Grand Canyon by river without life jackets. He was not driving a minivan into Death Valley in July. He was not going solo into the remote northern backcountry of Yosemite in June, with rivers running at snowmelt capacity. He was doing what people his age do in national parks all over the country, without incident going for a day hike, expecting to be back at his car by a reasonable hour, carrying whatever a day hiker carries for a familiar category of outing. The distance between that and gone is not, in his case, bridged by any dramatic decision or obvious misjudgment that a different choice would have prevented. It is bridged by whatever the terrain did that day, in the specific interval between his last confirmed position and the moment when he was no longer findable, and that interval, and what it contained, is officially unknown. The specific cause of James Pruitt's disappearance has not been established. His remains have not been located and confirmed through publicly available reporting in a way that would allow a definitive cause of death to be stated here. The case remains unresolved in the available record, his name attached to an open file in a park that receives 4 million visitors a year and sends almost all of them home. The most plausible framework, a fall or exposure, or some combination of the altitude and the weather and the terrain that produces outcomes in older hikers that the same conditions might not produce in younger ones, is available as a theory and remains exactly that. A theory without the physical evidence to close it into a finding. What the case holds, confirmed and documentable, is a parking lot, a car that sat there too long, and a man who walked into Rocky Mountain National Park on a day hike in 2019 and did not come back to it. The searches are over. The car is long gone from the lot. The park is still open. One more car in one more lot, engine cold, driver gone. 10 cases, 10 parks. 10 trails that opened up the way trails always do, inviting, marked, apparently manageable and closed behind the people who walked them without leaving any usable record of what happened next. Stand back from the individual files for a moment and look at what they share. Not the terrain varies as widely as American geography allows, from the rhyolite columns of Chiricahua to the volcanic cinder of Crater Lake, to the granite boulder fields of Yosemite's high country, to the Colorado River corridor at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, to the high alpine tundra of the Rockies. Not the people a 6-year-old boy in Oxford shoes and a 70-year-old day hiker, a 19-year-old athlete and a 22-year-old artist keeping a diary on a river, a trained law enforcement ranger and a 14-year-old girl with a camera, a family of 4 in a rented van, and a 16-year-old surrounded by 40 classmates. and an 8-year-old 50 feet from his father. The cases span 5 decades, from 1928 to 2019, across 9 states and a range of settings that covers almost every category of outdoor experience that American national parks offer. What they share is not the terrain and not the person and not the decade. What they share is the gap, the specific, narrow, unresolvable interval between the last confirmed sighting and the point at which the search begins. And everything that gap refuses to give back. Think about the measurements. Dennis Martin, seconds behind a stand of brush, yards from his family, within earshot on a grassy bald in broad afternoon light. Sammy Bolka, 50 feet ahead of his father on an open slope, the length of a school bus, visible and then not. Trenny Gibson, half a mile from the buses, inside a moving group, closer to safety than to anything that should have been dangerous. Stacy Aris, 50 yards south of a trail, near a staffed camp, in the afternoon light of a high Sierra day. These are not the measurements of remote wilderness tragedies. They are the measurements of ordinary distances, the kind of distances that people navigate every single day in every outdoor setting, without any outcome more alarming than a brief moment of losing sight of each other before closing the gap and continuing on. In each of these cases, that gap did not close. It opened instead, and kept opening, past the point where any search operation could reach the bottom of it. Here's the critical detail that the full lineup forces into view. Experience did not protect Michael Fissery. Professional training did not protect Paul Fugate. The presence of family did not protect Dennis Martin or Sammy Bilkey. 40 classmates did not protect Trenny Gibson. A staffed camp and an elderly companion, and an afternoon with hours of light remaining did not protect Stacy Aris. A modern search operation with dogs and drones and a $50,000 reward found Joe Keller a year later in terrain that had already been covered. And the coroner's ruling settled the mechanism but not the full sequence of what happened in the interval that mattered. Glenn and Bessie Hyde's boat floated out of the canyon fully packed without them, and the river that took them has been run thousands of times since 1928 by experienced boaters who have never recovered anything that answered the question of what happened below Hermit Rapid. The German family's van sat in the desert for 13 years while official searches produced nothing, and a private reconstruction reached only a partial answer that left 3 members of the group still unaccounted for in the publicly available record. James Pruitt parked his car in a lot in Rocky Mountain National Park and did not come back to it, and the searches that followed came back empty, in the way that searches in high alpine terrain with fast-changing weather come back empty when the window closes before the evidence can be read. Now this is where the final accounting asks something that no documentary treatment of these cases can honestly avoid. What do we do with cases that don't resolve? Not the ones that are eventually solved through forensic breakthrough or a witness who finally talks or a piece of evidence that surfaces after decades, but the ones that genuinely stay open, that hold their answers in terrain that has not given them back and may not give them back in any foreseeable time frame. The institutional response to that question is a listing in a database, a name, a date, a location, a status of missing that persists until something changes it. The NPS missing persons records contain names that have been on those lists for decades, attached to cases where the operational search concluded long ago and the file remains technically open because closing it would require a confirmed answer that does not exist. Dennis Martin has been on that list since 1969, Paul Fugate since 1980, Stacy Aris since 1981, Sammy Bolkey since 2006, Michael Fissery since 2005. These are not administrative oversights. They are honest acknowledgments that the terrain holds what it holds, and that the absence of a confirmed answer is not the same thing as a resolved one. But here's what doesn't make sense, and has never made sense about the way most people think about national park safety. The parks feel safe because they are presented as safe. The infrastructure of safety is everywhere. The trailhead signs with their distances and elevation gains, the ranger stations at regular intervals, the permit systems that create accountability for backcountry travel, the emergency call boxes and the cell coverage at the developed areas, the search and rescue protocols that mobilize within hours of a reported overdue hiker. All of that infrastructure is real, and it works, overwhelmingly, in the statistical sense that matters most. The vast majority of the people who enter national parks every year enter and exit without incident. And the ones who get into difficulty are found and recovered at a rate that reflects the genuine capability of the organizations responsible for their safety. The parks are, by any reasonable metric, not places that routinely consume their visitors. The case files in this document represent a small fraction of the total visitation across the decades they span. And that fraction needs to be named honestly to avoid the kind of distortion that makes 10 cases feel like a systemic condemnation of outdoor recreation. They are not. They are 10 cases that resist the resolution that the overwhelming majority of missing persons situations eventually reach. What they represent, taken together, is something more specific and more uncomfortable than a general warning about national park safety. They represent the irreducible residue, the small set of situations that the infrastructure does not catch, that the search protocols do not resolve, that the terrain holds past the point where any operational effort can recover them. Every system that is designed to catch failures has a failure rate. The National Park Search and Rescue System is not an exception. The 10 cases in this file are what its failure rate looks like in human terms. A boy in a red shirt, a girl with a camera, a couple in a boat, a ranger checking a nature trail, a runner on an afternoon jog, a family in a van, a child 50 feet ahead of his father on a cinder slope, an experienced backpacker in a remote drainage, an older man on a day hike. None of them are abstractions. All of them were people who parked their cars and walked away from them with ordinary intentions and did not come back. There is one more thing that deserves to be said, and it is not a warning in the conventional sense. The people in this file were not reckless. Most of them were not doing anything that the millions of people who visit these parks every year do not do. Stacy Aris was walking to a nearby lake with a camera, 50 yards off a trail near a staffed camp. Trenny Gibson was walking back to a bus with her class. Dennis Martin was playing a prank on the adults, the way children play pranks on adults on family hikes. Sammy Bolka was 50 feet ahead of his father, doing what children do when they are not quite ready for a good thing to end. James Pruitt was on a day hike in a national park at 70 years old, which is a thing that people do. The cases that feel most unsettling in this lineup are not the ones where the risk is legible. In retrospect, the Hydes running whitewater without life jackets in 1928, the family driving a minivan into Death Valley backcountry in July. The ones that do not release their grip are the ones where the decision was ordinary, and the terrain was not especially extreme, and the distance from safety was measured in yards, and the gap opened anyway and did not close. The parks are still there, all 10 of them. They will receive millions of visitors this year, the same way they receive millions of visitors every year, and the overwhelming majority of those visitors will complete their trips without incident and drive home with photographs and tired legs, and the specific satisfaction of having been somewhere genuinely large and genuinely wild for a day or a week. That is the true and accurate baseline. It deserves to be stated clearly in a document that has spent 20,000 words on the exceptions, because the exceptions are not the rule and should not be mistaken for it. But the exceptions exist. They are in the record. They are in the NPS database and the county sheriff's files and the newspaper archives and the families that have been waiting for answers for decades. They are attached to names and dates and specific geographic coordinates that place them in real terrain that you can visit, that you can stand in, that looks exactly the same as it did on the day each of these cases opened and has not indicated, in the years since, that it intends to explain itself. Return to the image from the beginning. The sunlit trailhead sign, the pine ridgeline, the parking lot with one car left behind, the kind of place you'd take your kids. That image is not a warning about all parks or all trails. It is a reminder that the parks are large in ways that our experience of them does not always communicate, and that the distance between the signed, managed, photographed surface of these places and the terrain underneath it is measured in yards and minutes rather than miles and days. The gap between lost and gone in the cases in this file was never very large. It was a stand of brush, a rock 50 yards off a trail, a cinder slope in October light, a road where a scent trail stopped, a river that came back alone. You locked the car, you stayed on the trail, so did most of them. 10 trails, 10 signs, and somewhere out there, 10 answers the map still won't give us.